Hello everyone, this is going to be your Unit 6 review video. I think it's better than me just doing a voiceover PowerPoint. I wanted to do it where you can see my face and also where I can be able to share my screen and show you different videos and different resources because I think Unit 6 is so important, but also I have a lot planned for the class going forward because Unit 6 is going to be the last unit that we review, but of course we still have many days until the AP test. So I'm going to explain to you of some of the things that I've added in Teams. I have a couple of notes here. I have the Princeton review over here, so bear with me. I'm going to record this all in one take, and hopefully it will be good. So first thing I'm going to do is share my screen. Here is my screen, and I'm going to go to Teams, and I'm going to go ahead and show you some of the cool things that I have planned for Teams. So in Microsoft Teams, before we only had one channel, and I know a lot of teachers don't make use of different channels, but I went ahead and made several different channels, and they're going to have different functions, and I'll explain to you more later on. The College Ready channel is where I'm really going to be posting different articles that are centered around explaining how the stuff that you learn in EP World History, not really the content so much, but more of the skills, makes you either a more valuable citizen in the United States or more valuable employable person and a better thinker prepared to succeed in college and in life. So here I'll post cool articles that are either sort of presentist, meaning it's kind of almost something historians don't like to do, but kind of focus on drawing analogies between the past and the present. Those are some types of things that might be posted in this channel. There will also be resources about the value of humanities and what are humanities in life, in incorporating it into college curriculums, and basically why you have to take it even if you want to be like a STEM major, because they have some added value, and this will all be in the College Ready channel. The Complexity Point channel, I've created a number of different channels about different points on the DBQ rubric. The Complexity Point channel is where I'm going to break down how you do it, how you can acquire the complexity point. Contextualization, same thing. Discussion section videos are where I'm going to post all the highlights from discussion sections of the week. I'm going to post them all right here. They will all also be posted on YouTube. Here's a great look at what a 10th grade U.S. history class using this type of student-led method of discussion called Harkness looks like. I think it looks really cool. I want to try to get us as close to that as possible in discussion sections and encourage everyone to participate. How to source correctly. There's going to be some guides posted here. Right now, there's just a couple of YouTube videos on thinking like a historian and critical thinking. Sourcing is the hardest skill on your DBQ rubric, and so it's very difficult to master, and I can see that, and it's very hard to get those 2 points from sourcing. Remember, you have to source at least 3 documents, but we're going to work here to get it. How to write a DBQ video. So I'm writing each DBQ that you're writing, and I'm going to go through my thinking process and explain the process of grouping documents again and again. I think one of the best forms of teaching is good modeling, and that's pretty accurate across disciplines. So I am committed to doing that, and I will commit to keep doing that. This is where there will be information on how to write a thesis. Right now, there's just stuff here in the Harvard Writing Center. More of it's going to be populated through the week. What's going to happen now is that as I give you specific feedback on your DBQs that you are turning into me Fridays, I will expect you, I'm going to leave a comment that says, okay, X, Y, and Z. Everyone's going to have everyone's going to have a comment, whether you're at the top of the spectrum, like you have turned the most beautiful DBQs, or whether you're at the bottom. You're going to have a comment, and you're going to be directed to go to a specific channel. You're going to be directed to watch a video, and then post something about something that you post something or reply to the video about what you learned. Pretty basic, pretty simple, but I think it's super, super important that I know that you are seeing the feedback that I give you, and that you are going to a resource where I better explain, or someone else explains how to make your essay better. And then I just want to know that you're understanding that, and then hopefully I'll see it in the next essay. If you don't do that, then your DBQ was all for nothing, and you're just going to get a 0 in the gradebook. Feedback is so essential. I don't want to sound like I'm being mean or it's a ridiculous expectation. Implementing feedback is a necessary aspect of life. As a teacher, when I get observed by Miss Jones, for example, or other members of admin, they give me feedback after they leave the classroom. They observe me once a week, they give me feedback, and I'm expected to implement that feedback and become a better teacher. Not implementing feedback is one of the quickest ways you can lose your job in the workforce. So make sure you take the feedback that I'm giving you and are trying to implement it in your next essay. Okay, so this is explaining the new aspects. One of the things that I also wanted to point out too is one of the cool extra credit assignments that I gave to you. I'm going through my discussion sections, is here. Oh my gosh, I really spent so much time on this, and I just really want someone to do it. I know that the kids that have turned it in so far aren't necessarily the kids that need extra credit, but it's really kind of fun. Like you watch a high school, college, or graduate commencement address, graduate speech or commencement address of your choosing. So there are 4 different graduate speeches and commencement addresses of your choosing. And then you're going to source one of the commencement addresses. I give you hints here about what particular aspects of SOAP that you can focus on in supporting either the sentence that commencement and graduation speeches are valuable venues for imparting knowledge, or that they're forgotten 5 seconds after they're delivered. I think it's going to be kind of hard, because these graduate and commencement addresses are really kind of spectacular, but I think you could definitely make that you can definitely support that second argument with SOAP analysis and sourcing. So go ahead and look at the hints that I gave you. There's some really cool commencement addresses. Conan O'Brien at Dartmouth, Chief Justice John Roberts at his son's boarding school, Meryl Streep at Barnard College, and Donovan Livingston's Harvard Graduate School of Education. Already, someone like me, I know that the speeches that I've compiled, maybe one of the things that I could focus on, if I'm very cynical, is the fact that they're all given to, it seems like, an elite audience. They're all given to a private school audience, an elite private school audience of some sort. Maybe not so much the Harvard Graduate School of Education, because it's filled with future teachers and educators, but they still go to Harvard, so maybe that is a good criticism. So just think, creatively about it. I think these commencement addresses allow you to take a break, and graduation speeches allow you to take a break from AP World History. Okay, without further ado, we're going to get into the Unit 6 review. This is the first part of the Unit 6 review. This is why I wanted to do the Unit 6 review using Microsoft Teams, because I have a lot of things that I want to show you aside from a guided PowerPoint. And so I'm going to switch in between videos and the PowerPoint. So Unit 6 is all about European colonialism and imperialism. It talks about the significance of, or we see colonialism and imperialism have been going on since well before AP World History Modern starts. Remember, we started the year 1200. We talk about empires all the time in our class, but I think European colonialism and imperialism is one of those big stories in AP World History that explains how the world really ended up the way that it did, and how some of the messed up aspects of the world are so messed up in some ways too, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But European colonialism and imperialism is really leaves no part of the globe untouched. And I'll show you a couple of cool maps explaining that. But first, I want to define what colonialism is. So colonialism is a practice of domination. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Colonialism is a practice of domination which involves the subjugation of one people to another. Okay, pretty basic, but what makes it different from imperialism? So then it goes on and it discusses like, well, maybe if you look at the etymology or like the origins of the word, you'll find the difference. So the term colony comes from the Latin word colonus, meaning farmer. This root reminds us that the practice of colonialism usually involved the transfer of population to a new territory, where the arrivals lived as permanent settlers while maintaining political allegiance to their country of origin. So that's kind of gets at the difference. Imperialism, on the other hand, comes from the Latin term imperium, meaning to command. Thus, the term imperialism draws attention to the way that one country exercises power over another, whether through settlement, sovereignty, or indirect mechanisms of control. So you can think of colonialism as kind of like a branch of imperialism, a subset of imperialism, where colonialism oftentimes involved physically settling in new territories that were occupied by indigenous peoples and still remaining politically allegiant to a distant territory. So the most obvious case of colonialism is like that all of you are probably familiar with is like American colonists coming to the New World, settling in North America, encountering indigenous Native Americans, but still remaining politically allegiant to the British Empire. I think it's one of those terms too where like we know what it means, but we just aren't good at explaining it, right? Because it's kind of amorphous and there's different ways that Europeans go about conquering the world, which we'll also discuss here. So the countries that have been under European control, so this basically goes from the 1500s to 1960s, and it's going to be the subject of your DBQ. So after Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue, he kickstarts this age of European colonialism in the New World, where the Spanish, French, Portuguese, and later the British enter the New World and they colonize the New World. There is a new imperialism, European new imperialism kickstarts in the mid 1800s and lasts until the early 1900s. And it takes place principally in Africa and Asia, right? So this doesn't all get covered at the same time, and not all of Europeans' control of these particular regions are the same. So you can see in North America, you can see that this is Europe, but colonized are controlled by Europe. You can see partial European control or influence. We're going to talk about spheres of influence in China and how that differed, and spheres of influence here in Saudi Arabia. And you can see like there are variations and types of European control. Pretty much the whole map is covered, but this takes place, European colonialism and imperialism basically takes place in two different stages. After Christopher Columbus sails the ocean blue in 1492, we learned in the last unit there's the age of revolutions. A lot of revolutions kickstart here and inspired by Enlightenment political philosophy and sure of themselves because of social and economic grievances, and they kick out Europeans here. And so when the Industrial Revolution takes place, and here we're getting ahead of myself. This is something that we're going to discuss in the slides. When the Industrial Revolution takes place and Europeans are suddenly have more industrial muscle. What I mean by industrial muscle is stuff like steamboats, all kinds of weapons, and also are hungry to feed their factories. They can't go here anymore because they were just kicked out. And so they head to Africa and Southeast Asia and Asia. In search of markets and resources. And we'll talk about that a little later. Um, what does this look like? This is a more dynamic map that shows, how European colonialism and imperialism kind of existed at different time frames. So it starts off, it's a really, really fascinating map that gets at how vast this was. So you can see here in 1492, it covers the Americas, and then Portugal was on the outside of Africa. This vastly changes in the mid 1800s. They start entering Africa, pretty much take over most of Africa and Asia, and then by the 1950s and 60s, decolonization, which unfortunately is not going to be tested in the AP World History exam, takes place, and we're left with the world of nation states that we have today, pretty much. So this is a really cool map. Go ahead and look at here and pause the video if you want to see more. Okay. So I think I already talked about the context. So rationals for imperialism, we're definitely going to talk about it. Rationals for imperialism are basically what explanations do Europeans give for why they engage in imperialism. Not too difficult. So the context is the Age of Revolutions meant Europe lost a lot of resources in the Americas. They lost territories in the Americas, and then the Industrial Revolution just took place. The European powers are suddenly given new industrial muscle. Remember, Great Britain is the first to industrialize, and it spreads across Europe, and they're hungry for raw materials and resources. So motives for imperialism. I think the principal motive for imperialism was economic. Europeans were in search for economic resources and markets, but Europeans definitely needed to justify why they are going overseas, and they do that with a variety of different, explanations that kind of come after the fact. But it's also not the only motive for imperialism, I should say. So Great Britain is in search, expanded its influence in this period. This is just the generic topics. It expands its influence in this period in Australia, South Asia, India, and Southeast Asia. You can see this British Empire here. Because it's in search of resources after losing American colonies. France is in search of prestige. They were greatly embarrassed by the Franco-Prussian War. Japanese imperialism, we're going to talk about this a little later. Japan is one of the Asian countries that manages to industrialize with the Meiji Restoration. And they industrialize after Commodore Perry, who's an American, comes to them in 1853. They realize that they need to industrialize because they don't want to give any concessions to the Americans or the Europeans that are coming that are already industrialized. So they industrialize kind of as like a counter weapon. They do it really fast and are doing it really, really successfully. And they manage to become an imperial power themselves. Let me just go back. China is not successful at doing that and industrialization. There's all kinds of pushback, and they actually get carved up here into spheres of influence. You can see the Germans in their hat, the British, the Japanese carving up China. There are all kinds of cultural and religious motivations for imperialism. There's racial ideologies going on, fake science, which is called pseudoscience. There's this belief, there's this weird fascination on the part of colonial powers to prove that they are superior biologically and genetically, or not genetically, but biologically than people that they colonize. They have like a fascination with like the study of skull sizes, and they try to determine that European skulls are bigger and therefore their brains are bigger. They misapply social Darwinism. They say stuff along the lines of, the fact that I can go and conquer you and kick your butt proves that you don't deserve to like exist as anything but dependent and subordinate to us, because it proves that you're less civilized, which is pretty messed up. But we've heard people say that in today's world, kind of like jokingly. I think I've heard it. I've seen it in a couple of memes. There's cultural ideologies, this belief that their culture is superior. There's this fascination with their language. There's this belief, for example, in like the places that France colonizes in Africa. There's this belief that teaching these people to speak French, French is a superior language than whatever language they're speaking. and it's more logical. There's all kinds of stuff like that. There's religious ideologies. There's, again, this belief, the need to convert people to Christianity. This new imperialism that is taking place, it kind of has the same and a lot of similarities with the old imperialism that takes place in the 1500s and 1600s in the New World, right? Some differences, but mostly the same. I think you could apply the 3Gs, God, gold, and glory again. Economic motivations for imperialism. I think these are really like the big factors. One of the things that I will say is like the rise of joint stock companies, like the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. It's just super fascinating during this period. You should view these companies as kind of like Google with private armies. There's this cool article that I'm going to include in the description of this YouTube video. I'm going to show it to you right now. And it's called Lessons for Capitalism from the East India Company. And it talks about how the East Indian Company kind of operates independently from the British political system, but it's also very tied to the British political system, obviously. But basically, Britain isn't, like, the government isn't the one that takes over the Mughal Empire. It's like a private company. It's like the same version as if Google were the one taking over the Mughal Empire in India. And they had their own private army. It talks about this at length. It's such a fascinating read. I think you should definitely read it. It's a cool read from the Financial Times. But I'm not going to make it mandatory yet. Potentially, I will make it mandatory, but not right now. This slide is just to show you that I have another YouTube video that is a lot shorter than this YouTube video. So if you're feeling lost or you feel like you can't read all the slides, but you just want the big picture idea, I would definitely go to the Unit 5 and Unit 6 text review or test review. There are 3Gs apply in both old and new imperialism. That's what I say. There's economic motives, search for markets and resources. In old imperialism, there's a desire to convert the natives of the New World, and new imperialism, desire to civilize. So there's a little bit of distinction in that. La mission civilisatrice, white man's burden. Social imperialism is this thing that I haven't talked about yet, but it's pretty prominent. There are penal colonies like Australia, for example. Britain believes that it can export its problems, so they export prisoners to Australia. And then social Darwinism. Y'all did really well, I think, on this unit test that talked about the causes of imperialism. And I think, you know, we're going to rewrite the DBQ that we already wrote because I think it's a really, really important topic, and being able to compare new imperialism with old imperialism, old European imperialism is so, so, so important. Like the motives, being able to compare the motives. All right, this is going to be your first assignment. What are the causes of European imperialism? That's going to be your prompt that's given to you in this fictional DBQ. Remember, you're only doing, like, this is a fictional portion of the DBQ, right? You have one document, document F. The source is Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden in 1899. Your job is to source the following document. Remembering the thinking process is here. I was supposed to include a little megaphone, but I forgot to include the megaphone, so it's just my face there. God, that's a horrible picture. But remember that sourcing a document includes one sentence summary, one sentence summary of how whatever you put diminishes or supports the credibility of the document or how it's relevant to the topic sentence argument, right? So get used to that formula. Your topic sentence that you're going to support is ethnocentrism and racism was a cause of European new imperialism. You're going to read this document, source it. I would look at maybe the purpose or the audience of this document. I think you could definitely integrate it to support this topic sentence. We read The White Man's Burden in the poem, and we looked at, not only that, we looked at like kind of literary elements in The White Man's Burden, and I think that was really cool, and you guys were able to remember that. So please don't forget this. Maybe even if you don't get The White Man's Burden as a document in your test, but you have a DBQ based on that, or based on European colonialism, maybe you would want to integrate talking about Kipling and the white man's burden in your essay, and that would count as outside evidence. And also make sure that you include one specific and relevant piece of outside information, outside evidence. My recommendation for this is include a specific event that's supposed to be an event, and give a date attached to that specific event, or talk about a specific ideology and explain how it relates to your argument. Talk about a specific ideology, define what that ideology means, and explain how it relates to your argument. So maybe you can talk about some racial ideologies. Maybe you can talk about like Europeans being obsessed with like skull sizes. That would be kind of like the specific and relevant information. Remember that you get 2 points for sourcing at least 3 documents, and then you get 2 points for incorporating 2 specific and historical pieces of evidence on your whole DBQ. So right now you're just working towards one aspect of that. So you're practicing sourcing one document and practicing integrating specific and relevant outside information, outside evidence. The other part of what you're going to need to do by Tuesday, April 28th by 11:59 p.m. You're going to cite this. Remember, the process of citing a document is completely different. You don't have to source every document, but citing is just a 1-sentence summary of like the main idea of the document, and then 1 sentence on how it supports the topic, sentence / argument. So it's actually not a lot, right? This is only going to be like 2 sentences, but make sure you get like what the main idea is. In particular, if you're given a chart like this for the document, then you have to kind of explain, what is, the purpose of the totality of this, right? And I think it deals with, the relationship between industrial technology and giving Europeans industrial muscle to conquer the New World. All right, so now we're going to talk about state expansion. So in the Vox video of European colonialism, you saw that the outskirts of Africa there were trading post empires on the outskirts of Africa, Portuguese trading post empire on the outskirts of Africa. The reason why Europeans didn't venture into Africa were because of ecological reasons. They were dying from malaria, so they couldn't really penetrate deeply into Africa. The discovery of medicines, anti-malarial drugs reduced the dangers of Europeans living in Africa, and it increased the dangers of Africans to Europeans, right? Or increased the dangers of Europeans to Africans, I should say. So the British take control of Egypt, British occupy parts of West Africa, French occupy parts in Africa. They settle in Algeria. We talked about the significance of Algeria. Again, we're not talking about information past the year 1900, because now this AP World History test only covers units 1 through 6. But the Algerian Civil War is such a fascinating topic, and we saw a scene from La Bataille d'Alger, the Battle of Algiers, and I think it was, it's so interesting because Algeria is so close to France that the French don't just view Algeria as like a colony. They view it as the same. They view it as an extension of French mainland. So them being forced to give it up is very hard for them. The Algerian Civil War showed the brutality of French colonialism bluntly. It showed before the Algerian Civil War, there was an apartheid state where Europeans and Africans basically lived and worked in different segments of society. Obviously, Europeans benefited. But colonialism, long story short, I think I digress way too much, but colonialism is just a horrific event, horrific thing. It always is horrific. The Europeans scramble for Africa in the age of new imperialism. So the Berlin Conference takes place. Germany, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck wanted to keep the peace in Europe, so he hosted the Berlin Conference in 1884 as Europeans began to scramble to colonize Africa. He wanted an orderly colonization of Africa, and Europeans got that. They divided Africa, and then you can see the divisions of Africa here. No Africans were obviously present for the division of Africa because they probably would have said no. The main motive, again, for Europeans colonizing Africa was simply to extract resources. So it made colonial boundaries. There's an orderly colonization of Africa. Africans made colonial boundaries that eventually, when Africans get independence, a lot of these borders that exist in African states to this day are very arbitrary. And this arbitrary nature of these borders contributes to a lot of Africa's problems today in some countries, because it might cut a ethnic group that had always identified as kind of a community in two, like this arbitrary division of people. It might, it kind of leads to all sorts of problems that you can imagine. Yeah, so you can look at this. The Boer Wars are a super significant piece of history that you might want to incorporate. I don't imagine you'd get a DBQ specific to it, but definitely look at it. It talks about the brutality of British colonialism in South Africa. This is the European scramble for Africa as well. King Leopold II wanted Belgium to colonize Africa. They get parts of the Congo, which is resource rich and has pretty much been it's resource rich in ivory and rubber. There is a great, and this gets me to my next point. Later this week, I'm going to be hosting a kind of preview of two super important books. This is to help support Miss Smith's AP Literature Goals senior year. I had wanted to read one of these novels. We never had time. And then, of course, distance learning took place, or the coronavirus took place as well. But Heart of Darkness is go ahead and go look at the book summary, but Heart of Darkness is something I'm going to be talking about, I think, on Wednesday. I'll talk about it on Wednesday, talk about like the plot of the novel and its author, Joseph Conrad's, maybe his main point that he's trying to make about colonialism and the evil nature of colonialism. And then I'll talk about Chinua Achebe's also points that he's making about colonialism and the criticisms that he actually makes of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness is believed to be about the Belgian colonization of the Congo, which was super, super brutal. All colonialism was really, really brutal, but the Belgians' colonization of the Congo was extraordinarily brutal. For example, you can see that there's a lot of I forgot what the word, amputation of arms. So the Belgians forced the Congo people to adopt, or to force them into a forced labor system. And oftentimes one of the practices that I read about, and that there's a lecture about that I also may make mandatory, is this is a better slide, that I also may make mandatory by Adam Hochschild. I don't know how to pronounce that. King Leopold's Goals. He wrote this book. But it talks about how the Belgians kidnapped the wives of males, and they forced the males to go into the jungles to cultivate rubber. And if they didn't meet the quotas, they might or cut off the hands of their children. So King Leopold, who's the Belgian king, is widely revered in Europe during this time period. People think that he's this incredibly great character in European history. He's really become a villain recently, especially with the publication of this book, which estimates that as many as 10 million people in the Congo actually died as a direct result of Belgian colonialism. There's this great lecture that I recommend that you watch, and I can actually show you that lecture that is given by Adam Hochschild. It talks about, some of the key points that he makes in this book, and some of the brutalities of Belgian colonialism. It also talks about like a system like colonialism doesn't just disappear, it's still, the legacy is still with us to this day. And it talks about that at length in a very intelligent way. And talks about how a lot of the failings of the Democratic Republic of the Congo's government after independence, after it finally gets independence from Belgium, is a direct result from Belgium still wanting to maintain economic interests in the country and arranging for the assassination of their first prime minister because he wanted to become economically independent from Belgium. And all sorts of crazy things like the establishment of a dictator. The colonialism and resource extraction on this scale still has effects to this day. So imperialism in parts of South Asia. So the big point here is that the British East India Company, so go ahead and look at that. There's a section in your Princeton review that I expect you to read. I will give you the pages of the Princeton review that I want you to read in conjunction with watching this YouTube video later. But specifically, you can go to 245 to 246 to read about British imperialism in India. In China, I'm just going to read sections from the Princeton Review. If you don't want to be bored with these sections from the Princeton Review, then you need to go read the Princeton Review yourself. As you know, for much of its history, China was relatively isolationist. It traded frequently, but it didn't make exploration a high priority. It also expanded by conquering its neighbors, but never took this expansion beyond its own region of the globe. Up until the 1830s, China allowed European powers to trade only in the port city of Canton, and it established strict limitations on what could be bought and sold. As the European powers, particularly the British, gained industrial muscle, they came barging in, this time with weapons and warships. In 1773, British traders introduced opium to the Chinese. By 1838, the drug habit among the Chinese had grown so widespread and destructive that the Manchu emperor released an imperial edict forbidding the further sale of or use of opium. Consistent with this edict, the Chinese seized British opium in Canton in 1839. The British would have none of it from 1839 to 1842. The two countries fought a war over the opium trade. This was known as the First Opium War. Overwhelmed by British military might, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, the first of what came to be known as the unequal treaties, by which Britain was given considerable rights to expand trade with China. China also, in 1843, Britain declared Hong Kong its own crown possession, basically a colony for Britain. The Opium Wars had a huge impact on global perceptions of China. There's internally, people are humiliated and they begin to rebel, but externally, other European powers in the United States now view China as weak and want a slice of the pie. So internal rebellion started at the beginning of the 19th century with the White Lotus rebellions led by Buddhists who were frustrated over taxes and government corruption. They continued through the middle of the century with the Taiping Rebellion. The Taipings, led by a religious zealot claiming to be the brother of Jesus, recruited an army nearly 1 million strong and almost succeeded in bringing down the Manchu government. The rebels failed, but the message was clear. China was crumbling from within and unable to stop foreign aggression from abroad. In the 1860s, the Manchu dynasty tried to get its act together in what became known as the self-strengthening movement, but it did no good. In 1876, Korea realized China was weak and declared its independence. Later in the Sino-French War, Sino means Chinese, French War, Chinese lost their control of French Indochina, basically Vietnam to Vietnam to France, which became known as French Indochina. If that wasn't enough, then Japan gets in on the action as well. The European powers are rushing to establish a greater presence in China by establishing spheres of influence. France, Germany, Russia, and of course Britain carved up huge slices of China for themselves. These spheres were not quite colonies. Instead, they were areas in which the European powers invested heavily, built military bases, and set up business, transportation, and communication operations. The Manchu dynasty was still the governmental authority within the spheres. By the 20th century, nationalism among the Chinese peasants and the local leadership was festering. Anti-Manchu, anti-European, and anti-Christian, the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists, or Boxers, as they came to be known, organized in response to the Manchu government's defeats and concessions to the Western powers in Japan. Infuriated, the Boxers' goal was to drive the Europeans and Japanese out of China. They adopted guerrilla warfare tactics. The Boxers slaughtered Christian missionaries and seized control of foreign embassies. Ultimately, however, they were not successful in achieving their aims. Instead, their uprising resulted in the dispatch of foreign reinforcements who quickly and decisively put down the rebellion. The Manchu government, already having made great concessions to the Europeans and Japanese, was then even further humiliated. As a result of the rebellion, China was forced to sign the Boxer Protocol, which demanded that China not only pay the Europeans and the Japanese the costs associated with the rebellion, but also to formally apologize for it as well. On its last legs, the Manchu dynasty couldn't prevent the forces of reform from overtaking it from both within and without, and as a consequence, Chinese culture itself started to crumble. In 1901, foot binding was abolished. In 1905, the 2,000-year Chinese examination system was eliminated. By 1911, the government was toppled, and imperial rule came to an end. For the first time under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen, a republic was established in China. Okay, so you can see all of that. Japanese imperialism. Japan was one of the Asian countries that industrialized. By the 19th century, remember, they were also very isolationist. In 1853, I think I already discussed this, Commodore Matthew Perry from the United States arrived in Japan on a steamboat, something the Japanese had never seen before, and essentially shocked the Japanese. They quickly realized that their isolation had resulted in their inability to compete economically and militarily with the industrialized world. So they begin to industrialize under the Meiji Restoration, and they become imperial powers themselves. Sorry, I just wanted to read the excerpts from the Princeton Review because it doesn't do me well just explaining them and like doing all the point by point, because the Princeton Review is already a good summary and a resource, and explaining these events and the chronology of these events. The Princeton Review does a good job. Imperialism in Southeast Asia. You can see that, again, France controls Vietnam. They take it from China. The Dutch in Southeast Asia, you can see specifically where. The British in Southeast Asia, the British East India Company. Remember, the British East India Company is the big, it's kind of like a giant Google. They have a relationship with Britain. They're based in Britain, but at the same time, they're more independent from the government. They're like a giant Google with a private army. You can see their exploits in Southeast Asia here. American imperialism in Latin America. So removal of indigenous peoples. The U.S. continued its tradition of taking land from native populations in the 19th century. So they forced the relocation of eastern woodlands people from the southeast U.S. to Indian Territory in Oklahoma. This comes to be known as the Trail of Tears. Remember, the United States is a colonial power itself. It's founded based on colonialism. Old colonialism, though. There were people here first, indigenous peoples here first. It continues its process. And in some ways, the United States never stopped being a colonial power. There are still, indigenous peoples, Indian tribes that are still, have kind of autonomous institutions from the United States, but are still kind of dependent and subordinate to the authority of the United States at the same time. There are all kinds of Indian reservations that still exist. The Monroe Doctrine. So after the Age of Revolutions, Monroe issues this doctrine that basically says, Europe, you need to stay out of the Americas. This is our place where we're going to influence. So it does come across as like, no, only we can intervene here. And the United States does. The United States engages in the Mexican-American War. You'll learn more about this in AP US History next year. Oh my gosh, dear, I'm not going to have you guys so very soon. But with Miss Quintanilla, they'll talk about how James K. Polk starts the Mexican-American War, is looking to start it in order to gain a lot of territory from Mexico. For example, the place we live in now, the Rio Grande Valley, was once Mexican territory. Expansion on land. The United States has this idea, manifest destiny. I'm told that the teacher of the year, Miss Perez, did a really good job of teaching this. All of you guys remember it from however she taught it. I'm not clear specifically, but it was this belief that the U.S. had destiny to expand from coast to coast, that they needed to expand to the Pacific. It's very colonial thinking. And then expansion overseas that takes place roughly at the same time that Europeans are expanding or colonizing Africa. The United States starts a war with Spain, and they take over, before that, they take over Hawaii. They start a war, the Spanish-American War, and they win. Spain gives them Guam, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Puerto Rico still kind of has that like imperial relationship with the United States in the sense that Puerto Rico isn't granted the full autonomy or full rights that a state has. And so it's more subordinate to the United States political system. Cuba, we've since given it back, but we've kept like Guantanamo Bay. The Philippines used to be a U.S. colony, etc. And much of the same motives for keeping these colonies persist, or much of the same motives that Europeans had for colonization and colonialism also exist for the United States. This idea we have to convert, we have to, civilize these people, but also let's get resources, let's make them markets that we can sell things to as well. Outcomes of imperialism. So check out that slide. So here are some responses to imperialism and colonialism. Obviously, people are going to push back. I'm not going to go through this at length, but you can go ahead and pause the video as needed. Please pause the video as needed. Tupac. This I would also very much look at. I'll post a Vox video on British colonialism in India. Okay, so assignment number 2 is actually pretty cool. I wanted to create something fun for you guys because I know at least the people that are doing the work are doing a very good job. So assignment number 2, part 1, is due Wednesday, April 29th by 11:59 p.m. Your instructions are to watch one of you're going to definitely watch this guy's comedy sketch. His name is James Arcaster, and he talks about the absurdity of the British Empire. The links are in the description of this YouTube video. And watch one of the following comedy sketches. Either this guy, Unuvab Pal, I hope I did pronounce that right. He's an Indian that talks about colonialism in London, and he makes a comedy sketch about that. And then an excerpt from Trevor Noah's also comedy sketch about colonialism. You're going to answer the following questions. Make sure you take note of the sentence length. Is comedy effective at conveying the horrors and absurdities of imperialism? Why or why not? That's a pretty simple question. It has nothing to do with sourcing a document, but it's fun. It's to give you guys a break. After watching James Arcaster's sketch, what are the limitations of his perspective, the essence soap? So what I wanted to get at here is I didn't want to put him on the spot necessarily because I think Trevor Noah does basically the same sketch that he does. But there are some unique perspectives and unique ways in which Arcaster is kind of limited in talking about British colonialism. All of them are rightfully critical of British colonialism, but Arcaster kind of focuses on one subject, which that subject is the stealing of African art that became a big deal about a couple of years ago. So basically the backstory is that a lot of African art was looted from Africa by European colonialists and ended up in British museums, German museums, French museums. And for some reason, I don't know what kickstarted it, but African nations had been asking for it back. what kickstarted the debate. And then as recently as 2 years ago, it became really kind of popular in like criticizing European countries' responses and European museums' responses, which was basically like, no, we're not giving you the art back. So both he makes fun of it and he does as well. But what I want you to get at with this second question is like, James Artcaster is a British person. Trevor Noah was born and raised in South Africa. He was born and raised in India. So what do their perspectives add to explaining the horrors and atrocities of colonialism? And what makes his perspective more limited? Because he is just a British citizen. He is a British citizen. And then finally, the last question, all these comedy sketches are funny. What do they reveal about the horrors and legacies of colonialism? So here we're actually going to watch, or actually before we watch Artcaster's comedy sketch, I want to also talk about assignment number 2. Part 2, you're going to read the following Washington Post article. A controversial article praises colonialism, but colonialism's real legacy was ugly. And you're going to answer the following questions. Okay, so we're going to talk about those a little bit more in depth right now. So let's see, Artcaster's speech. You can watch the rest of that, but it's satire, but it does get at like the very real controversy that recently took place. There's this cool New York Times article. So recently, Emmanuel Macron was asked in 2017 about whether he thought the restitution or like the returning of African art to Africa from French museums after they were looted and stolen should take place. He said it should. Emmanuel Macron is the French president. And then I think since then, some artwork has been returned to Africa from France. A lot of Germans and other major colonial powers did not agree with it. They said that they did a better job of being stewards of the artwork. They did not want to return it. They gave a lot of excuses that you can see in the description. You can look at one of the YouTube videos that Trevor Noah in The Daily Show kind of like makes fun of a lot of these like curators at major European museums that make all these kind of very absurd excuses for not returning and restituting African art. This article kind of focuses on like, what does it mean for these artwork to be, repatriated and go back to Africa? And it, what is going to be the impact, the cultural impact? What are going to be the implications of that? So it's a really cool article that I'll also include in the description. One thing I did talk about King Leopold already, but I also wanted to talk about like this lecture is just so really cool. It's very, it includes a lot of I wouldn't want to say moving images, but a lot of images that are kind of very saddening. And the history that Adam Hochschild, who wrote King Leopold's Ghosts, describes, and the way that he links, Belgium's colonization of Africa with a lot of the same problems that the Congo faces to this day are just haunting. I think one of the coolest images that I saw in this, where are they? So it talks about, it's a great lecture, and explaining all the nuances is hard, but it talks about how like Congo has, since after independence from Belgium, they've faced all kinds of adversarial circumstances that were stirred up by Belgium, so to speak. Belgium assassinates their prime minister at one point, and they help install and support a dictator in Mobutu, who rules the Congo for several years. There's chaos, civil war, etc. All kinds of exploitation that really comes and should come. This is a really powerful image as well, but I would just look at this lecture. I don't want to explain it too much, but it's a really cool lecture. Now we're going to transition a bit. Before we transition, I forgot. Why do I always forget? See, this is what's kind of hard about shooting the YouTube video all at once, because you forget all of these like cool things that you want to talk about. Well, I find cool. I don't know if you find it cool, but I do. I'm nerdy. But this is also the second part of the assignment that is due Wednesday. You're going to read this article. This article talks about there was a article that praised colonialism as like essentially giving like infrastructure to colonized peoples. And the author of this piece basically says, here's all the research that calls BS on that. It was really horrible. And so the assignment's already there. You know what it is. So some points I guess I really want to highlight. There's a large body of scholarly research on why some former colonies have fared better in economic and political terms than other. The reversal of fortune thesis suggests that countries that succeeded in the post-colonial world were relatively poor when they were colonized, but those that have done the worst were often the most prosperous to begin with. There's these MIT economists that kind of suggest that countries that were really, really rich, like India and like the Aztec Empire and the Incan Empire, basically European colonialism set up extractive institutions. And these extractive institutions still persist to this day, and this also kind of helps explain why they're poor to this day. It also explains the variance in different colonialisms. People often like to be colonized by the British as opposed to the Spanish or the French. But recent perspective, like Caroline Elkin's research about like Britain's putting down of the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, also suggests like the British used very draconian and repressive tactics to keep their empire in place, like torture. It's true colonial governments invested in public services and infrastructure such as hospital, railroads, roads, and schools, which is, I guess, kind of the benefit of colonialism. That's a cringy thing to say. But careful scholarship shows that these investments did colonies little good. In his brilliant 1994 book, I read this book actually in my pro seminar, my Intro to Georgetown, Africa, Drugs, States, and Bugs. I read this book. The African Colonial State in Comparative Perspective. Political scientist Crawford Young systematically tracks African colonial taxation and expenditures. He finds that tax burdens on small farmers, workers, and other colonial subjects far exceeds any reciprocal investments in public goods. While the bulk of the money was allocated toward maintaining the colonial government. In parts of West Africa, the tax burdens on farmers were so high. So basically, the colonial state set up like an extractive, was aimed at extraction. That was the objective. It's also worth noting that neither of these arguments are given. One study found that only 10% of African countries have experienced ethnic conflicts that can be traced back to some pre-colonial origin. So on the news a lot are all kinds of ethnic conflicts that are taking place in Africa. A lot of them are rooted in colonial origins. So one of the tactics of colonization was called divide and rule, where you would prop up one minority group and you would try to divide the populations. You would prop up one minority group and try to help them or make them the managers of your state. And this would cause a lot of resentment in another minority group. But the whole objective was to prevent them from unifying each other. Another example would be the Hindus and Muslims in India. So I'll include a link in the description about how Britain really especially after Britain leaves and India gains its independence and Pakistan gains their independence, the effects of colonialism and colonization are still felt. And so go ahead and take a look at that one. This is a cool article. Okay. So I think, yeah, we talked about the positive of colonialism, I guess, railroads, steamships, These are kind of like the raw materials that colonialism was trying to extract. Again, raw materials. Economic imperialism is really interesting because economic imperialism has a highlight on economics. So, for example, in the Belgian case study, after decolonization, although decolonization is not something that's going to be tested, but something definitely that you can talk about in your DBQ if you wanted to go for that complexity point. But economic imperialism kind of focuses on, maybe a country has political independence. From example, the Democratic Republic of Congo gains political independence from Belgium in that lecture that you can go look at from Hochschild. But the Belgians also kind of conspire to preserve their economic interests. And one of the ways they do that is, although a new prime minister comes to power, they go ahead and try to coordinate an assassination of him with the CIA. Eventually, they just do it by themselves and they assassinate him because they want to maintain their economic interests. And they support a dictatorship to maintain their economic interests. So it all focuses on, imperialism doesn't necessarily have to be political. It can also be more economic as well. It can also come in the form of intervening every now and again, or I guess economic imperialism also comes in the form of maybe it's also more surreptitious, so to speak. So it's kind of more secretive, right? Political imperialism, or imperialism where like the colonial administrators are right there, it's kind of more obvious. Once you say, okay, well, now you're independent, I'm going to wash my hands of you, and you're still kind of conspiring. Economic imperialism will be like still kind of conspiring behind the scenes. So economic imperialism takes place during this period. We talked about the British East India Company, so go ahead and read through these slides. We talked about spheres of influence. I read that long passage from the Princeton Review, so read through this slide about economic imperialism in China and spheres of influence. Economic imperialism in Africa, in Latin America. The U.S. is is a major economic imperialist country in Latin America. United Fruit Company would be the most famous case. There's this cool book that I was going to have you read. The United Fruit Company worked with the U.S. and Latin American governments to keep trade profitable for the company. Banana republics, small Central American countries under the economic power of foreign-based corporations. So basically, the corporations have all the power. The banana republics really don't have any. Politically unstable with economy dependent on export of one or two limited goods. And some say that's how the U.S. wanted it. Then there's also a couple of subunits in this final unit, like causes of migration, which might feature in your DBQ. I just think it's kind of hard to imagine. I think imperialism is more likely a subject, but slavery was abolished in most places, but the practice continued for many years, abolished in 1865, 1886, in Cuba, 1888, in the mid 1880s, or I'm sorry, in the mid 19th century. Indentured servitude is still a thing. So just think of migration as being both coerced and kind of forced and semi-coerced, and then, a response that you're doing as a response to a stimuli that is kind of forcing you, or not necessarily a response to a human, but maybe you're fleeing a famine, poverty, etc. So there's all kinds of different forms of migration that take place in this period. So look through these slides. We talked about penal colonies, like in Australia. Penal colonies are all the rave in this era because there's belief that you can export your social problems, just export all the convicts to Australia in Britain's case. And so that's one form of migration that's taking place during this period. In India, might leave due to poverty. In China, you might leave due to political instability. So just trying to remember those key themes would be the key to doing well on this one. In Ireland, because of the Great Potato Famine. In Italy, poverty again. Effects of migration, we see this today. People often don't very much like people that are migrating to the New World. So here, or that are migrating, or people don't tend to be very hostile to immigrants, and that's obviously a theme today. Remittances, these are very popular here in the Valley. We all know people that work in the United States and send their money back to Mexico. Remittances are obviously very popular during this migratory period as well. Also, the creation of enclaves. This is also an effect of imperialism. The creation of enclaves are just like places where people migrate and they kind of isolate into like a common culture. It leads to like the creation of like Chinatowns and like New York or etc. That's what an enclave is. I showed you like the picture of Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown that I really liked going to. Prejudice, all kinds of prejudice. There's prejudice by the United States. They have the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. They don't want any more Chinese. In California, Chinese are brought by or come to California in search of economic opportunity in the form of gold, etc. So with migration, there's all kinds of push factors and there's also pull factors. So just thinking about that, these broad themes, like migration can be coerced, semi-coerced, or maybe even like free. There's like push factors, there's pull factors. There's going to be effects of migration. There's going to be hostility towards migrants. All of these, read through them certainly, but those are the big ideas that you want to go away with and armed with into the AP test on May 21st. Okay, your final assignment due Friday, May 1st, is the DBQ Motives for Colonization. We've done this DBQ before. Evaluate the extent to which the motives used by European states to expand their empires in the 16th century were similar to those in the 19th century. So basically, you're comparing old and new imperialism. I actually show you how I wrote this DBQ. I did that before. It was one of my earlier YouTube videos. I'm going to write this DBQ as well, probably Thursday or Friday. Because I think I can write it better. And we shall compare. Keep doing what you're doing. Is there anything that I wanted to show you? No, maybe just the actual thing. Okay, so this is going to be located on assignment number 3. It's going to be located as a Word document. If you want to just work off this YouTube video, here you go. There's document 1. Time yourself. Make sure you complete it within 45 minutes. You can look at the video that I give. I already gave you as a resource. All right, call me, beat me if you want to reach me.